We do strive to be intentional in our language. All of us, everyone here, including Lauda and myself, we have to remain open to learning and recognizing that language itself is not static, but is ever evolving. It's always changing.
Okay, so just a quick note about our objectives for this morning. First, we will provide you with an overview of recent Texas legislation. We'll also make a note about the legislation that has been happening in the US overall that impacts specifically our LGBTQ+ survivors, trans and gender diverse survivors, and survivors of color. Next, we will discuss the implications of that legislation, along with the current overall socio-political climate for survivors with marginalized identities. And finally, we will wrap up by providing practical strategies that you can use as advocates and providers to effectively navigate and incorporate the considerations we're talking about into your trauma-informed practice.
All right, so how did we get here? This started centuries and centuries ago whenever the Americas were first colonized. We don't have the time to start there. So we're going to speed up a little bit and start around 2020. So 2020 saw the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota by a police officer. And there was video. I think we all should be familiar with George Floyd's murder. And that kind of re-sparked the BLM or Black Lives Matter movement, especially for non-Black folks. And so that's white folks, other people of color who maybe didn't fully understand the BLM movement or didn't understand that we were in and are in a modern civil rights movement. So you had millions of Americans taking to the streets saying, hey, I can curse, right? This is fucked up. And so we can't just have things, business as usual. So
sorry, would it be all right if y'all slow down a little bit for interpretation, please? Thank you.
Okay. All right. So this sparked the modern civil rights movement, and every civil rights movement is met with what is called white lash. And white lash is white backlash. And so this has happened and will continue to happen. And that is when people in power, specifically here white people, usually white people, respond negatively to outpouring of support for a civil rights movement, especially when they see that people aren't acting in their place and are getting uppity or moving into higher positions of power, and they resent that. And white people as a whole then feel that our power is likely to be taken away, our jobs are taken away. This sort of rhetoric just continues, and it reaches a point to where legislators then start taking action. And that's what we see with anti-woke bills. So even the term woke, which started in the Black community to refer to someone or something like recognizing the white supremacy all around us, recognizing the systemic oppression that happens, and to stay woke, to stay aware of that, and to move forward with that knowledge in mind. Then it has now been reappropriated and misappropriated by white conservatives who will use it pretty much as a dog whistle to mean social justice or to mean, anything progressive, and sometimes just to mean Black. They use the term DEI in a very similar way. If you've heard any in the news, someone referring to someone as a DEI hire, that's exactly what they're saying. They're saying this is a person of color, or this is someone who is not white and heterosexual in this position, and we don't like that. So, as I said, it goes from the civil rights movement to discriminatory legislation. And so with these two charts, you can see the first one is the United States overall.
Candace, we can't hear you anymore.
It looks like she froze on my end.
The audio and visual is. Oh,
Are we back? Okay, we appear to have been kicked out, but we're back. Okay, so the civil rights movement, the white lash to that shows up in discriminatory legislation, as we have in the US a majority white legislators. So in the US overall, in the past 5 or 6 years, it's increased the number of anti-LGBTQ plus bills have increased 11-fold from about 50 in 2019 to over 500 in just this last year. I have a similar thing happening in Texas. And because we just have to be number one at everything, last year, Texas introduced and passed the most, like more anti-LGBTQ plus bills than any other state. And this is especially upsetting because Texas has more trans youth than any other state in the US. And a lot of this legislation was aimed toward youth. We noticed that part of the, and this is not an accident, this is not a coincidence, this is intentional. The people pushing for this, people funding anti-trans and anti-queer legislation, and providing, lining the pockets of some politicians are the same people who were against Roe v. Wade and the fall of that, and who come for a lot of individual rights. We're talking Heritage Foundation, Alliance for Defending Freedom, all of these groups with great sounding names, depending on your perspective, that are trying to squash any of this woke nonsense. So you'll see Texas had a lot like passed last year. We only meet every other year in Texas, the legislation does, or the legislature. And in 2023, we actually had 6 anti-LGBTQ plus bills passed. 2 of those didn't make it through the courts, but 4 still did. All right, so some of these laws, they were suggesting all sorts of things, banning gender affirming care, taking the medical licenses of physicians who provide gender affirming care. There were some bills proposed here in Texas to limit or totally ban gender affirming care, not just in the healthcare kind of medical realm, but also that means gender affirming therapy. That means gender affirming counseling, calling in a school, calling a child by a name that they like, by their preferred name or by their pronouns that they've chosen. Some of this has gone through, some of this hasn't, but the bill that did pass here in Texas is SB 14, Senate Bill 14. Went into effect last September, and this past June, 2 months ago, there was an appeal to this bill, and it went through the courts and But last June, the Texas Supreme Court said, yes, no, we're going to go ahead and fully implement this. It is not unconstitutional, unfortunately. So this bill specifically bans physicians in Texas from prescribing transgender youth, and specifically trans youth, gender affirming medical care. So this could be what's called puberty blockers. This is HRT or hormone replacement therapy. And this is surgery, top surgery, bottom surgery, any sort of gender affirming surgery on a trans minor, which is very rare that happens anyway, but that is now banned, and it's part of like the scare tactics. Oh, we don't want, do you want people performing surgeries on your kids? It also bans insurance coverage of any of the things that I mentioned, puberty blockers, HRT, or surgery for trans kids, and revokes the licenses of physicians who do not comply. It compels the Texas Medical Board to revoke those physicians' licenses permanently. Also, I don't think we have time to go into that other part, so I just won't say that. The purported goal of this bill was to protect children from harm, and specifically to protect minors from scientifically unsound treatment. And 2 months ago in June, when the Texas Supreme Court ruled to uphold this ban, they said that the risk of providing these treatments to children solely for the purpose of physically transitioning from their sex at birth was not outweighed by the benefits. So how might this bill impact SA survivors? And you can put in the chat if you want to unmute yourself. We'd love to hear, how do you think that something like this might impact survivors of sexual assault and abuse? Anybody? All right, yeah, we can go ahead and move on. We can tell you how SB 14 impacts SA survivors. So first is increased mental health challenges. And so trans and gender diverse minors are already, who are survivors of sexual violence, are likely to experience increased rates of depression, certainly suicidality, anxiety, dysphoria, so gender dysphoria. Yes, Cindy said one less previously available resource. Absolutely, we will get to that one.
Yes. Sorry to interrupt again. If we could just slow down a little bit for interpretation, please. Thank you.
So trans folks, trans and non-binary folks, youth who are already have 13 times the rate of suicidality and suicide attempts as their cisgender peers, are even more likely, and we see this with increased rates of suicidality and attempts when they are survivors. Everything that all of the reactions that are very normal for SA survivors to have are just amplified for trans and non-binary survivors. I've had clients talk about, what's the point that this feeling of worthlessness. Their government doesn't care about them. Sometimes their families don't care about them. Nobody cares about me. What does it matter if I'm here anyway? And so we just see a compounding of the suicidality rates. Also, an interruption in care that they were already getting. So this can cause physical health issues, all sorts of health complications, because part of SB 14 was that even if a youth is already on puberty blockers or already on HRT, that they have to stop in a reasonable time frame, which physicians providing this care said there is no reasonable time frame. But the government said at least by this past January, all kids in Texas that were prescribed those by physicians licensed in Texas had to stop. And so any of the benefits that they had been experiencing physically, mentally, emotionally, not only stopped, but often went backwards. So then with that, we see increased gender dysphoria, increased hatred of their bodies, increased just self-loathing across the board, along with increased costs and potential criminalization if they or their parents decide to, seek resources out of state. I'm not going to go into that too much because there's some cases pending on legally what that can look like, but suffice to say that there are currently options for parents of trans and non-binary youth to seek healthcare outside of the state, and that comes with increased costs. Next is erosion of trust in healthcare providers. So this loss of bodily autonomy, this should sound familiar if you're working with SA survivors. They were not in control of the situation, maybe in control of their body during the assault or the abuse. And this is yet another way that they are not in control of their bodies, of what happens to them, at least until they turn 18. They can perceive this as a betrayal by the healthcare system, even if the doctor let's say their pediatrician was prescribed, or their endocrinologist was prescribing them these medications. Now they no longer can, and teens may or may not understand that that is not the choice of the physician. That is the choice the state is making. And even if they do understand that, it can still feel like a betrayal and still feel like we're not on the same team. This can lead to avoidance of healthcare services altogether. And this includes therapy services. One of the bills proposed, like I said, was going to ban therapy and counseling that was called gender affirming. That didn't pass, but not everyone knows that. And there are some folks out there that are kind of propelling that myth, saying, no, you can't go to therapy. It's illegal. All sorts of discouragement from seeking, healthcare. And then again, the mental health consequences, just compounded rates of depression, anxiety, PTSD, suicidality, all that good stuff. It's just another added barrier to recovery for survivors. Again, like we said, you can't say it enough, increased mental health concerns, compounded trauma, increased stigma and alienation from their previous support networks, disruption to recovery. We all know that recovery is not linear. Healing from sexual assault is not linear, but this really has some ups and downs. If things have been, I'm starting to feel better in my body. My body is feeling more like it's mine. I'm being seen and recognized by those around me as who I believe that I am and who I know that I am. And then that just has to stop. And think about a trans or non-binary or just a queer youth who already, people may not believe them about being a survivor. People, it didn't happen like that. It wasn't that bad. Are you sure? He's such a nice guy, yada, yada. We know all of that. And then also being told that, no, you're not who you say you are. No, you are a boy, you are not a girl, or vice versa. Or, this is a phase. It's just, again, that compounded trauma that can disrupt everything and has a really negative impact on their self-esteem and identity, not just gender identity, but just an overall sense of who they are and what they're about.
Okay, so shifting our conversation just a little bit to continue talking about how legislation impacts survivors, this time with a focus on anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion, or anti-DEI. So the map that you see here shows a representation of the legislation that has been passed. Since 2023, 85 bills in 28 states have been introduced. 14 of those have been signed into law, including here in Texas, which we will talk about more in just a moment. Another 14 have final legislative approval, and 53 have been tabled or failed to pass. There are more than 160 college campuses that have been affected by this legislation. And we're seeing now that even some campuses in states that do not have legislation active or pending are starting to make changes to their DEI programs out of anticipation that the legislation is going to eventually make its way to them. So here in Texas, we are talking about Senate Bill 17 or SB 17. SB 17 was effective September 1st of last year. And oh, I didn't change. That's what happens when you copy and paste and don't check the language on your slides. So what actually does Senate Bill 17 do? It prohibits Texas public universities from establishing or maintaining a DEI office or hiring anyone to perform DEI duties. So this includes any policies or procedures designed or implemented in reference to race, color, or ethnicity, conducting any trainings, programs, or activities in reference to race, color, ethnicity, gender identity, or sexual orientation, unless they are approved by the institution's attorney or general counsel. And so it effectively bans all diversity training. The purported goal of SB 17 is, and I quote, to protect students, faculty, and staff from being forced to adopt certain political beliefs and prioritize social justice over merit and achievement. The bill's author, Brandon Creighton, a Republican from Conroe, who is the lead author on SB 17, stated that DEI programs have been shown to be exclusive. They are ineffective and politically charged. Many of these programs have been weaponized to compel speech instead of protecting free speech. So, largely conservative support for these bills state that their concerns are that white students who are exposed to the history of racism in the US would be made to feel responsible for the actions of their forebears. Additionally, they claim that DEI programs are discriminatory, giving students with marginalized identities unfair advantages over white students. Other reasons that they put forward for their support for anti-DEI legislation is that they are a waste of taxpayer money, and that DEI centers are trying to indoctrinate students with progressive ideas. So, knowing that, if anyone is willing to put in the chat some of your thoughts about how Senate Bill 17 might impact survivors of sexual violence. And while at the initial look at this bill, you might not think it has an impact, we will talk a little bit more about what it does. And for time, we'll keep moving through, but please feel free to put your thoughts. Okay, so here is an overview, but we will get into each one of these points in more detail. So first, the cutting of DEI programs means that providers will receive a lack of training. This, as we know, cultural competence and cultural humility when working with survivors from any trauma-informed perspective does require that we consider the cultural context of that individual and how their identities impact not just their experience of trauma, but also how they experience healing.
They're multiverse, if you will.
Exactly. And without training programs, providers are not able to have the necessary training to know how to interact with folks from a diverse set of backgrounds. So exactly, Scotty, thank you so much. Marginalized groups might feel less supported, so less likely to refer or to disclose. And yes, that is absolutely a point that we will get into more. Without training, we're also losing an intersectional focus. Campuses have started to identify trigger words that should not show up in training programs. So obviously diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also words like marginalized, intersectional, or intersectionality. These terms are being banned from training programs for fear that they will not be compliant with the legislation. And institutions who are not compliant risk losing their funding. And since institutions cannot afford to lose millions of dollars in funding, the pressure to comply is very much real. And so without that training, we are losing out on the education for how to help folks know how to support our survivors with intersectional identities. Next, reduced support services. So absolutely, and this has come up in the chat, thank you so much. We have seen the closure of many different DEI centers. This was mentioned in a presentation that Candace and I attended yesterday, that many advocates who are working on college campuses are housed out of women's centers or women and gender centers. And the closure of these offices means that those advocates may be moved into other areas, such as a Title IX office. And when we think about the structure of our campuses, those may not be the most effective places for advocates to be housed when you're interacting with the same system that you may feel is also betraying you or causing you secondary trauma, which we know is very common from survivor experiences. So we have reduced support services that are available, or support services that have been changed that no longer feel as accessible. In addition, the closure of certain centers means that we are losing physical safe spaces for students on campuses where they might have felt like they had an area on campus where they could connect with other people with similar identities. They felt affirmed and validated. Some of those centers have been forced to close their doors, meaning that we're losing those spaces for students on campus. And that leads to a feeling of reduced community support, well, not just a feeling, but a reality, as well as how this can impact a student's sense of belonging on campus. And we know that that's intricately tied to student success. Barriers to reporting, this was brought up in the chat. If you feel like your identities are not going to be valued in a space that you enter, what is your likelihood that you're going to disclose that something traumatic has happened to you? So the erasure of spaces on campus means that we are creating additional barriers for survivors to access the services that could help them get the support that they need.
Add something in here. And also queer and trans survivors, and this is also, that was in the presentation from yesterday. Katie, I can't remember her last name. Radicek, something like that. It was her presentation. But she said that trans and gender nonconforming folks we know are more likely to be sexually assaulted before they turn 18, as well as afterward, and bisexual women. So this isn't just a hypothetical, this is a reality. And for queer and trans people of color, it's even higher. Sorry, go ahead.
No, thank you. Also, we see that for institutions that have to comply with Senate Bill 17 for our public schools, which do, enroll and then matriculate a large number of students, especially students from marginalized backgrounds because of the cost, that the removal of DEI programs can impact the trust that students feel in an institution. And so while from a staff perspective, we may understand that there is no choice but to comply with the legislation, students can feel as if it's an institutional betrayal, that the university now has to close centers, remove programs, and that can impact how likely they will be to seek support from an institution that they now feel is unsupportive or hostile towards them. And one big component of many DEI programs is that they will do intentional outreach to populations that may be less likely to seek support for a variety of valid reasons. And so without these outreach efforts to ensure that students from marginalized backgrounds are aware of the resources available to them, survivors in those communities may remain unaware that support is available, or the specific support for their identities may no longer be available. Okay, and then we know that there's an impact of SB 17 on advocacy and policy efforts. So banning DEI effectively weakens the available advocacy efforts that can support survivors' rights and their access to services, as well as what services are even available on campus. Without diverse perspectives on policy writing and policy development, it can lead to the creation of policies that are less inclusive and don't adequately address the needs of diverse survivors, which further marginalizes them. DEI bans can also lead to decreased funding, reducing the available resources. And similarly, any existing resources might be reallocated away from programs that serve marginalized survivors and leading to an overall reduction in services. Okay, so what we've talked about so far isn't positive. We are going to end our presentation with some things that you can do because it probably feels pretty bleak so far. And it's gonna get better in a minute, but not just yet. So first, just wait. First, we felt like it was important to emphasize that everything that we have been talking about so far is on top of a baseline of minority stress. And so if you're not familiar, in 1995, the minority stress theory was introduced. And essentially, the theory itself describes how minority groups, our language be a little bit different, right? Minoritized groups experience levels of chronic stress that are moderated by different coping mechanisms, whether those are like internal and individual or on the collective and community level. There's a really great quote about that talks about the baseline of minority stress, and this comes from Dahlia Kinsey's book, Decolonizing Wellness. And she writes, systemic oppression is a deadly pre-existing condition. Psychosocial stress and minority stress theory summarize bodies of research that indicate that BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ individuals experience higher rates of poor health outcomes in response to the chronic stress of both institutional discrimination and perceived discrimination. While institutional discrimination blocks access to resources that support well-being, such as healthcare, housing, and employment, the experience of interpersonal discrimination itself stresses the physical body and compromises overall health, regardless of access to resources. And so the minority stress model really is the predominant model for understanding health disparities among both racial minority as well as sexual and gender minority folks. And while it started, the theory began with a focus on racial minorities. It has since expanded to include sexual and gender minorities. So this would include our LGBTQ+ folks, as well as our trans and gender diverse individuals in our community. And the model specifies that the additional stress burden that is specific to a person's identities are over and above the typical stress experienced by non-minoritized folks, and that it's those stresses specifically that are responsible for the health disparities that we observe among racial and sexual and gender minority people.
There are two main types of these stressors, distal and proximal. So distal stressors are experiences of prejudice or discrimination, being mistreated or victimized by others due to some aspect of our marginalized identity. Proximal stressors are things that haven't happened yet, but are likely to happen. So this is the stress from expecting that you're going to be discriminated against. This is the stress. An example for women would be the stress of it's at night and you're going to your car and you check the back seat, right? You look, and right when you get in, you're not checking, you are locking the door and trying to get out of that parking lot as fast as you can for your own safety. There might be no one else around. You could do this 50,000 times and maybe nothing ever happens. But there's still that additional stress in the preparation for, okay, if something happens, I've got my keys in between my knuckles, I need to be ready to go. There's a great book called Under the Skin. I highly recommend it. And it talks about minority stress theory specifically for Black Americans and why across several different levels and different places, Black Americans' health, physical, not just mental health, but physical as well, is so much worse than white Americans. It's called Under the Skin. It's the name kind of creeps me out, but it's a very, very, very good book. Highly recommend it. And the author goes into all of these different examples, whether we're talking about maternal birth rates and death rates, if we're talking about risk of cancer, disability earlier in life, all of these things. These, again, aren't hypothetical. These are supported by data. This is supported by research. And all of these cumulative effects, the impact of them is not to be dismissed. Talking, cancer, disability, higher rate of chronic diseases, migraines, feeling less rested during sleep, even. Let's see. Bruce, can you explain the note about? Oh, gotcha. So yes, So the first three resources on there will not, going back to the helplines that we have, the first three will not, yes, Linda Villarosa. The first three will not contact law enforcement without your explicit consent. 988 may, if you talk about, if a caller talks about being suicidal, it may be a harm to themselves or others. 988 and most hotlines and helplines will reach out to police, send law enforcement to your home to do a wellness check, that sort of thing. But the first three, the Thrive, Blackline, and the trans, which one? I can't remember which three we did.
Blackline.
Yeah, Blackline,
Lifeline,
Thrive, and
And
Trans Lifeline, right?
Trans Lifeline.
Yeah, they will not. That's what the note was for. All right, so in short, summarizing all of this minority stress model stuff, the experience of trauma that is due to intentional human acts, rape, abuse, killing, terrorism, those sorts of things, leads to heightened perceptions of threat that may have an impact on a person's capacity for and interest in engaging with others, self-reflection, closeness with family, connection with community, and even ethno-religious or national, boundaries. So this in turn emphasizes the need for an approach to trauma risk, to the work that we do, to trauma risk and resilience that fully engages with each of these sociopolitical dimensions. It doesn't make sense to treat someone that comes from, has various marginalized identities and is a survivor the same way that we would treat someone who doesn't have those same identities. So here's where we get into what can we do? It's not all is hopeless, not all is lost, folks.
Yes, so here's where we start to turn the page, because everything that we've talked about so far and so it's natural that it feels really heavy. And where we wanted to end our conversation is talking a bit more about each of these 6 categories, because there are actionable steps that we can take to support survivors, even in the midst of everything we have talked about so far. The legislation, the sociopolitical climate, the ongoing realities of anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ sentiments, police brutality, minority stress theory. Even with all of these things, there are still steps that we can take as advocates, as direct service providers, as any role that we have has a sphere of influence. And within that sphere, there are things that we can do and encourage others to do that can make positive differences for the queer, trans survivors and survivors of color in our orbits.
So for these, you will notice there are both micro and macro examples. So macro meaning like from an organizational standpoint or maybe a statewide standpoint, and micro on maybe if you're in direct services, person to person, advocate to survivor. So within your organization, go back and look at the history, the origins of your organization. Was it started by a bunch of white ladies? If so, totally fine. And is that still who's in the leadership 40, 50 years later? Who are we serving? What clients historically have we served? What clients historically have we missed? Have not come to us because it doesn't feel like a safe space, because it may not, unfortunately, be a safe space because they don't offer services in languages other than English. And these sort of things. Research your mission, identify the gaps, and talk about accessibility. We know that rape does not just happen, and childhood sexual abuse does not just happen to poor people, does not just happen to Black or brown people, does not just happen to people of any specific nationality or country of origin. It happens across the board. And so when we're looking at who we are serving, what survivors we are serving, what their families look like, what the barriers to services and to healing might be, we have to take that into consideration and either use our power if we're higher up in these organizations or advocate on behalf of our survivors if we don't maybe have that much institutional power to pressure people to like, okay, let's look at this. Let's see what we can do differently, because no organization is perfect. So once you identify those barriers, then address those barriers. A common example would be like an SA center that maybe isn't near any bus lines. So if you have a car, cool, let's say you have a parking lot, free parking, love that. But if there's no public transportation, how are people who don't have a car, or families where they just have one car that they're sharing? Let's say, childcare. What are they going to do with their kids? If they are, let's say, a single parent, or if they're caring for more than just their own kids, can they bring them to the SA center? Are there childcare services there? All of these things to address these barriers. The next one, diversify. I was about to just move right in there. So next is diversify. So this is diversifying your network. So diversifying who you are networking with, not just within your center or within your practice, but outside as well. Do you know any Black psychiatrists who, in your area, who specialize in trauma? They're out there. Do we know who they are? Do we know any Spanish-speaking therapists who are not just willing, but really enjoy working with the queer population, or maybe are queer themselves? We need to be able to cross some of these lines. Look at your own personal network, your own friends. Am I a white person hanging out with a bunch of white people? Again, not necessarily anything wrong with that, but why is that? Kind of delving into like, is there anything that I am missing, or anything that any identity or perceived identity that I bring to the table with survivors that might accidentally harm them, might impact them in a not so positive way? We talked about resources, assessments, and tools. Oh boy, this could be an entire presentation. So many of the assessments, diagnostic criteria, even if we're talking about PTSD, so many of the tools that we use to screen for mental health conditions, or to screen for trauma even, are created by and normed on white folks, and typically white middle-class folks. So that is very, very, very limiting. The days are gone where we can just take, this equal, A equals B, and just apply that to everyone across the board. Because of these intersecting identities, because of this marginalization, not everyone has the same access as the people that, this may have been normed on. Even if we're talking about someone's faith background, the way that someone interprets something in their religion or in their culture or in their language might be very different from the people that these assessments were normed on and created by. And that's often something that comes from a position of privilege, right? And so if I'm a white person creating this assessment, I may not intentionally be excluding anyone from this. I'm creating a trauma screener, and I want to help, and I'm all for survivors. I just have that blind spot, right? My privilege allows me to have that blind spot. And so this is asking you, okay, let's take those blinders off. And I know I'm picking on white people. It's fine, we can take it. But this doesn't just go for white advocates. This is for anyone. Kind of, okay, what are my identities, and how does that relate to, what's my positionality? How does that relate to the identities of survivors that I'm working with? And lastly here, community partnerships. So how can I network, again, kind of the network with psychiatrists, or with churches in like communities that I would, we would like to serve, but we don't. What can we do? Is there any housing support that we need, any housing authority or group that we can have a specific partnership with that's really going to benefit our clients? Legal access obviously is a big issue. So just relooking and diversifying our community partnerships, especially after something like SB 17, where previous resources, you're a student at this university, well, they have an LGBTQ plus resource center. They don't anymore. And so what are we going to provide? What are we going to offer our clients instead of that? Last is train. Train yourself. Read, listen to podcasts, educate yourselves as much as you can, and train your staff on cultural competency, cultural humility. If you are an LPC or a social worker or a licensed marriage and family therapist, this is part of your code of ethics, is to be culturally competent. This is not optional. This is not, oh, well, I don't really work with those people. We don't care. You do, you may not know it, or if you're not, that's a problem. Engage qualified trainers. Ideally, if you're bringing trainers to your organization, one, pay them. Pay them for their time and expertise. Two, bring people with lived experience if possible. It would make no sense for me to go up there, my white ass, and say, here's what Black Americans are feeling and thinking, and here's what you need to do with Black survivors. No, you need to hire, ideally, a Black survivor and pay them equitably. Encourage your own self-reflection. My personal hero, Dr. Annalise Singh, I've got to get her in, always. She has a book that is the Racial Healing Handbook or workbook, can't remember, but it is for anybody to examine their own positionality, not just regarding racism, but regarding sex, gender, sexual orientation, ability status, age, all of these different things. Assess the effectiveness of your programs. Again, who are we serving? Who are we not serving? Asking our clients what's missing here. What would you love? What kind of support would you love to have? But you haven't even asked for it because you know it's very unlikely they're going to have it. Go ahead and ask your clients, even if you can't meet that need immediately, you can still get together and make a push to take steps to eventually meet that need. And then adapt as needed. The same, crisis intervention training from 10 years ago likely needs to be updated. We need to adapt to current life, to a quote unquote post-COVID life, to, what is it like for folks, to be living, to be a survivor and they're hearing about their family members also being assaulted, overseas or being killed in a genocide. All of these things, we have to make sure that we are up to date with not just the tools, but also the strategies, and that we know what we can anticipate the client needs ideally before they come to us and say, hey, you really missed the mark with this, that, or the other.
Mm-hmm. And can I add a point
Please.
to that? Is that I think a lot of the trainings that, as you said, were created, 10 years ago, may not have been inclusive of same-sex partnerships. And so ensuring that when you're talking about the dynamics of domestic violence or the dynamics of, what are these different forms of sexual violence, that we're including the fact that that this happens in all types of relationships, and we should make sure that our conversations and our training materials are representative of that, so that we're not continuing to reinforce the incorrect narrative that this only happens between men and women.
Like the power and control wheel is a good example of
Right.
stuff that's like and the language is very binary. And even though all relationships may be equal in terms of value and worth, they are not the same.
Okay, so what else can we do? The list keeps going. So under acknowledge, one of the things that you can do, this may be in sessions with clients or when you're meeting with someone for an intake, is just have an awareness of your positionality and the power dynamics that are at play. Be aware of what biases you hold, and because we can't eliminate bias completely, we can only be aware of it, and then that awareness helps to prevent us from acting unconsciously on those biases. So do think about your positionality, because as much as we will hopefully be making efforts to level the power differential, we can never completely eliminate that as an advocate, we are in a position of greater power than the survivor we are speaking with. And so we have to be aware of what we can do with that power and how we can use that to create positive change. Let's see, there was another note that I was going to make about power, and then it just escaped me. The other part, the political aspects note on here refers to the fact that trauma work is inherently political. I know, we started yesterday with a note from our TASA leadership that this is a nonpartisan issue. And while it is nonpartisan in the fact that sexual violence can happen to anyone of any background, the response to and aftermath of and resources available to survivors of sexual violence is very much a partisan issue, and it's a political issue. And not acknowledging that is harmful to the survivors that we serve. So we have to be aware that, trauma healing and survivors, that we see, their identities have been politicized on purpose, and their identities, specifically queer identities, trans and gender diverse identities, identities of color, have been politicized in order to reduce the available support and resources for them. And again, not saying that is negligent to the people that we serve. Okay. In terms of humility and how we can practice that concept and further the work that we're doing in positive ways is to be humble and honor the different journeys that people are going to take. As Candace mentioned earlier, we all know from doing this work that healing is not linear and it does not look the same for every person. As much as I know I've interacted with survivors who want the steps to healing, this is what I do first, and then here's what I do second, and then eventually I get here and I'm done. We know that that's not, unfortunately, the way that it works. There's not a roadmap. Every journey is different. And so what works for someone may not work for someone else, and what works for someone at one time may not work for them at a different time. So we have to remain open to what that particular survivor's journey looks like. And we also, want to stay away from pathologizing things that are normal and common reactions to trauma. Our psychology and counseling fields do a great job of pathologizing things and assigning diagnoses to reactions that are just a normal response to horrible things happening to you and happening to people you love in the world. And so recognizing that, acknowledging those reactions as such is going to be much more helpful for folks at the end of the day than it is to slap a label and diagnosis on it. We're also called to consider intersectionality and how, as we've talked about throughout our presentation, how those intersecting identities interact with each other to create unique lived experiences for each survivor, and not just their experience of trauma, but also how they experience their healing from that trauma. We must avoid stereotyping, making assumptions, misgendering, and dead naming folks. This is also another place where you can consider what power you have. If your intake forms don't have a place for preferred name, that could be an opportunity to incorporate that in.
And not just for queer folks, it might be an Elizabeth who goes by Lizzie.
Mm-hmm.
This can help everyone.
Absolutely. And then listen to feedback directly from survivors. Anytime that a survivor is willing to share feedback, whether it's positive, but especially if it's critical, should be considered a gift to you, because it takes a lot of vulnerability and a lot of trust to share feedback, particularly when it's critical. And so incorporate that. And what feedback mechanisms do you have at your agency or in your practice to get client feedback? It shouldn't be just reliant on the survivor to find ways to give feedback to you, but do you have, things that are easy to incorporate, like anonymous surveys, or things that can be like dropped into a box? Because we've both been in places where you just drop the thing into a box after your intake was over. So think about what you can do to gather feedback so that it can be incorporated into your work.
And it might be hard to accept critical feedback. We get that. That's a very human response, that defensiveness, and it's not about us.
Mm-hmm.
look at the, try to see the bigger picture.
Yeah, and that goes back to humility. It's not about you. It's not about me. It's about advancing our work to more effectively support survivors. And then finally, be intentional. And so intentionality when it comes to, decolonizing your work, there are a lot of really fantastic resources related to decolonization practices.
I'm going to include some in the chat right now.
Beautiful. Thank you, Candace. We love a book recommendation, so you'll see that pop up in the chat. And decolonizing practices take a lot of effort. They are very deliberate. They are repeated. It takes a very concerted, gradual effort over time. So it is much like our survivors might want the 1, 2, 3 steps to healing. We might want, as advocates, the 1, 2, 3 steps to decolonizing, and it doesn't happen that way. It's intentional work over time, and there are a lot of fabulous resources. That's also a whole presentation by itself that you can continue learning from. Next, self-care is great. We love self-care. It's also really important to understand that self-care can't fix everything. Therapy doesn't fix everything. It can't. It's not designed to. And particularly with what we've been talking about today regarding these, ingrained socio-political ideas of like U.S. culture, you can't self-care your way out of oppression, out of minority stress. Like it's just not, it's not going to work. And so, self-care and community care are both essential practices. Yes, we do need to do the things that help to refill our cup, but how are we also taking care of one another and taking care of our communities so that we are creating a better world for us all? We've talked about cultural competence and the importance of, providing culturally competent services. Depending on where you're located, there may be some barriers to incorporating this, but I would encourage folks to still consider what are some ways that, culturally competent trainings, as Candace talked about earlier regarding like education, how can we continue to have that so that we are still exposed to the content that we need in order to, do our jobs in the most effective way. So for instance, for where I'm located, there are limitations to diversity trainings, but we can bring in external speakers and have them talk about a DEI topic, for example. And so that's exempt from the legislation here in Texas. So one of the recommendations I got from someone at another training at our higher ed conference that should have been in here, but it included like, know the policy, know it, read it. I know it's legalese and it makes my head hurt to like get into it very much, but we cannot rely on other people to interpret laws for us because, and many times, especially what we're seeing right now, is that the interpretations are very conservative and they may overcorrect from a legal perspective because they're trying to avoid risk. And so what we can do on the front lines, so to speak, of providing this work is know the policy so that we are informed and educated about exactly where the lines are. And I'm not talking about cheating anything, but I am talking about just knowing what the boundaries are so that we can work within those.
John Lewis is getting good trouble.
Yes, we love that. So engage in the advocacy work, do what we can from our own, positionality. And, in regards to the not being passive, we are in this work. You can't stay in this work for very long if you don't truly care about survivors and their healing. And so we have a responsibility to the survivors we are serving to, we can't just throw our hands up and say, well, this, we can't do this and we can't do that because of X, Y, and Z. because however we might be feeling regarding, helplessness or despair, that is going to be magnified for someone who's currently actively processing a trauma. And so our responsibility to the survivor is that we center their experiences and not make it about ourselves, which gets into the last part of, what we've talked about across these 6 categories, provide some actionable steps so that we can avoid the doom spiral, that everything is terrible, and therefore we can think about what we can actually do instead of just giving in to the grim reality of what we deal with on a daily basis. And truly, that is something that everyone in this space already has practice in, because we know that sexual violence isn't going away anytime soon. And so in order to continue doing the work, we have to have some degree of hope that healing is possible. And so the same thing I think is true for what we're talking about.
Mhm. I think of the quote, the MLK quote, I know, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, and it doesn't bend toward justice by itself. It's through the actions, the collective actions, community actions, that it actually does bend towards justice. There's always a backlash to increased civil rights, and that's okay. That doesn't mean we quit.
Mhm. All right, so with that, we are getting to the end. Thank you, Letties, for being here. So our call to action for you with our social justice puppy here is to, and you can share it if you want, but this is really just a reflection question, is to think about one thing, one step that you can take back to your organization that takes into account what we've been talking about today, and that helps you to continue serving, because you are serving these populations, whether you realize it or not. Continue serving our trans and gender diverse survivors, our LGBTQ plus survivors, and our survivors of color in our current landscape.
Yeah, if you can think of any actions, feel free to put them in the chat. If not, we understand if it takes some time to reflect on these, but at least for yourselves, reflect on them and see, think of what you can do, what power you hold, how you can move the needle forward.
Yes, and as our social justice puppy has to say, I am part of the system of oppression. I can and must do something about it. And there is something that we can all do about it in our daily work. So that is it. And we do have a QR code up here. It is the TASA survey. If you could help us and help TASA by completing the survey, that will provide us with some feedback about what we can do. Thank you for your patience at the beginning of this with some of our technical difficulties, and bearing with us, as I know we had to move through a lot of heavy content. So here is our information. If you do have anything else you want to chat about? We've got 9 minutes left, I think. We may have moderator support in figuring out the next steps. But we are also happy to be a resource after this, and our contact information is here for your contacting pleasure.
And if you want any additional resources, I added some of the books with their authors in the chat, but any additional resources or references for where we found things, feel free to email either or both of us, and we're happy to provide that.
All right. So
Thank you so
all
much.
for
Thank you to our presenters, Candice, Laura, and also our interpreters, Alejandra and Gabriela. Thank you so much for your support, for your information and knowledge. And I am going to go ahead and drop that link for the TASA survey again in the chat. And thank y'all so much.
Yeah, we'll hang around here, I guess, for a little bit in case anybody has anything in the chat. Yep, anything in the chat that you want to share or any questions.
Oh, just a moment. I can stop share.
I know.
Oh,
here, yeah.
Okay. Well, people might need contact information.
Yeah.
Should I leave it?
Yeah, leave it at.
Okay. Thank y'all so much.
Yeah. Oh. This is little story time. We presented at TASA in 2018.
2018 in South Padre.
Yeah, in this same place. And was that Dear White Counselors?
That was Dear White Counselors.
Yeah, so we had a presentation called Dear White Counselors. Like what white,
Anti-racism and
Yeah.
trauma-informed work, basically.
yeah, and some people walked out. Some people were not pleased. And so we always come into these
Yeah.
like kind of expecting that like, right, this is
a lot. Yeah.
That's a lot. It's grim. It's a lot of it's ungrateful work. Like
Uncomfortable.
it's very uncomfortable. And fuck it, like we're here, we're gonna do it. And so we really, really appreciate when y'all say thank you for this and that you appreciate the presentation. It means a lot to us.
Mhm.
Anything else I should put in the chat? I put all the books.
You put on this?
Mhm.
I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording, but feel free to stay.